Hey, good evening. It's a fine Monday night. How are you, my sisters and brothers? A great time to be learning. That was Joey Newcomb's song, Mi Ki Amcha Yisrael, who is like your nation, Israel. Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us as we get together for a little learning to start off the work week, as it were. Yehudit Sobel says Erev Tov from South Carolina. Stephen from New Hampshire. Chaim says Charlotte is in the house. Paul is with us from Chicago. Melissa from Great Neck. James from Indianapolis. Hector Zepeda from Reno, Nevada. Welcome, Hector. Christo Cheney with us saying good evening, Salinina. John from Sedona. Rochelle from Modesto. Harold with us with Loretta in Oregon, Randy in Florida, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Lucy in Minnesota. Renee says Indy is in the house. Joanne, Hannah, Rivka Prater with us from Somerset, Texas. Bill Eldridge with us from Arkansas. Hector's with us from Central Valley, born in Merced, raised in Livingston. Penina with us and saying Erev Tov from New York. Allie, first time catching it live. I'm on AT Daily number 120 and trying to catch up. Hello from Norfolk, Virginia. Welcome, Allie. Great to have you with us live. And Sheila says hello from Montana. Lynn with us in Texas. And Shira also in Texas in Dallas. Welcome, everybody. All right, we are holding on Daf Test. That's page 9 of Tractate Pesachim, the 4th volume of the Talmud, the laws of Passover. We're in chapter 1, and we're finally moving on to a new Mishnah. We're going to be discussing Mishnah number 2. Before I read you the Mishnah, let me just quickly address a couple of questions that have come up in the last few days that I was not able to answer. One was regarding coins that are found. It came up because we were talking about the principle of sometimes we follow the majority, sometimes we follow the last. In other words, in cases of uncertainty, when we're not sure what it is that we're holding, are we going to say, well, the majority of objects like it are such, and therefore this is probably like that? Or are we going to say, well, the most recent objects that came into our possession are such, and so probably this one that we're not sure what it is like the most recent? And in analyzing that question, we looked at coins found in Jerusalem. And basically the Mishnah was saying that if you find it during a festival, it probably has sacred status because people came up to Jerusalem. This is ancient Israel, ancient Jerusalem, when the temple was standing, and people would go up for the pilgrimage festivals with their second tithe money in hand to spend in Jerusalem. And at other times of the year, most of the money found on a typical street was non-sacred money, and it would have this non-sacred status. As part of that discussion, we talked about what happens when we find coins on the floor. May we pick them up? And the common understanding in the Talmud, and it is indeed the halacha, when you're talking about a small amount of money, just a coin or two that has no identifiable features, no one can say that's my coin for sure, because it wasn't in a coin purse that's identifiable. If it's a large amount of money and they could say exactly how much and the way that it was bound, totally different story. But in terms of coins, if you find it, you can pick it up. Why? Because now normally we have an obligation to return lost objects, but a small coin that fell out of someone's pocket, they're going to naturally despair of finding it again. They're not going to expect that they go back and find the coin that they dropped on the street. So somebody suggested, I think it might have been Lynn in Texas, that the modern law is, well, we don't pick it up because there is a chance that the person will come back. Now, that's probably based on a ruling of Rambam, of Maimonides, who said, well, we don't know that the person has despaired of losing it. Perhaps he hasn't even checked his pocket. He doesn't know that he lost it. And since he doesn't know that he's lost this coin, he wouldn't despair of ever recovering it. He doesn't even know he lost it, right? He doesn't despair of recovering it. But that actually is not the halacha. And the way that we rule on Rambam's ruling is that unless we have a reason to believe that a person did not despair of recovering a coin that he lost, we assume that he has despaired. And if we see a coin on the street, yes, we can pick it up. Now, I did see a lovely teaching on this idea that if you're walking with a child and you see a coin, you say, well, we're entitled to pick that up, but let's assume that God put it in our path so that we would then acquire the opportunity to pass it along and give it to charity. We're not obligated to do that, but it's a great opportunity to teach the child a lesson. Say, now you have a choice. Which charity do we want to support? And then the kid can feel empowered and with an important, mission now to give that money to a valuable and deserving charity. We had another question that came up at the end of yesterday. We were talking about searching for chametz on the eve of Passover. The first Mishna was about searching for chametz, leavened products, on the night of the 14th of the Hebrew month of Nisan. And we learned in the Mishnah that one searches for leaven in his house, in her house, by the light of a lamp, by which we mean a single wick. These days we would use a candle. In old times it would be more an oil lamp with a wick in it, but it was a single wick and a single flame. And the question was asked, well, and then we said that we don't use a torch because a torch is actually less effective in a house for getting into the nooks and crannies and the corners. The torch it's too large, it's dangerous, we'll be afraid of burning the house down. We don't want a big bright light that's, omnidirectional between us and the place we're trying to search. We actually will not see as well as we would with a candle. But the question was asked, may we use a flashlight? Because in modern times, okay, so now we have a device that is highly effective for looking in nooks and crannies and corners in the house as we look for, stray crumbs of leavened products that might have escaped our spring cleaning, as it were. So can we use a flashlight? And I looked it up, and the answer is yes, we can use a flashlight. We have that ruling from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein and others. However, most authorities will say better to start your search with a candle and then go to the more effective tool of the flashlight. Some will say, yeah, the flashlight actually is better for searching out in terms of the light that it casts and the directional quality. But the candle, the single flame wick, has a spiritual component that is irreplaceable. Why? Because when we're searching for chametz in our houses, for leaven in our houses prior to Passover, we're not just searching for breadcrumbs. We're searching for the residue of places and times in our house when we acted arrogantly, highfalutin, as it were, as if we're more important than anyone else, as if we're more important than having God sovereign in our lives. We made ourselves sovereign in our lives. And we want to root that out. And so as we've learned that saying, that line from Proverbs, right, that the soul of a person is the candle of God, so that a slightly wavering flame is much more reminiscent of a person's soul, and this idea that we need to inspect our own souls when we're searching out the breadcrumbs. And so the flame of a wick is so much more effective at reminding us to do that. And so that's why we want to at least start that search with a candle, if not do the whole thing with a candle. A flashlight, is a little bit clinical, as it were, a little bit cold. And so we would prefer to use a candle, but the flashlight is permissible. Okay, let us read Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 1 of Tractate Pesachim on the laws of Passover. After conducting the search on the night of the 14th, one need not be concerned that perhaps a marten, in Hebrew a Hulda, it's an animal, drag leaven from house to house or from place to place, and therefore placing leaven in a house that was already searched. As if so, one need also be concerned that perhaps leaven might have been dragged from one courtyard to courtyard and from city to city. And in that case, Ein ledavar sof. There is no end to the matter. So this phrase is lovely. Ein ledavar sof. There is no end to the matter. You might recognize, in your ear might recognize there, the ein sof, ledavar means the matter, like the word or the thing. But the words around it, ein sof, there is no end, that's actually one of the names of God. And it's the idea of what God's existence was like before God made any manifestations within God, created angels and other spiritual creatures, or created the physical universe, when it was just God, right? When God was God was alone by God's self, and there was just endless God in every direction, undifferentiated. That's the sort of primordial pre-existence of the universe. And when it was endless light is another nice way to translate that. But Ein Sof literally means no end, right? So it's nice to have that phrase show up, even though split with the matter, there is no end to the matter, as it were. Regarding this teaching now about what we're talking about, the marten, right? So we've searched the house for leaven. We did a spring cleaning. Then on that night, we went and made sure that there's no stray crumbs anywhere. And we don't have to remove the leaven yet. So then we were going to place it in a very contained, even concealed place, because we could still eat some on the morning of the 14th, the next morning after that night when we did the search. And then we burn it the next day at midday, right? But the concern is all the areas that we searched, and now we know there's no leaven there. Well, what if some cute little creature like this? Is this not the cutest thing ever? That is a marten. All right. This is particularly a pine marten, but the idea is these are small, quick little mammals that in Israel were known to go inside people's homes and get some food. I already have a request. Show that again. I mean, it's just so cute. All right. So the marten, if he came into the house, right, and went somewhere and found some of the leaven that we're still holding to eat the next day, and then he kind of dragged it away, and in dragging it left some crumbs, or he went from one house to another and he had crumbs on his chin, as it were, so he might cause these more stray crumbs, leaven, to be now found in the house. So just in case some marten came in, do we then have to go and search again? So says the Mishna, no, you don't have to worry about that, because it's possible, but it's unlikely. And if we're going to consider that possibility as so, significant that we have to search again, there will be no end to the matter, because it could go from one house to another, from one courtyard to another. Who knows where the martens are? As we'll see in the discussion, if you actually see a marten come in your house and drag away some bread, so then, you're going to have to do the search again, because now you have very reasonable cause to believe that maybe some of that chametz, got spread around the house. Okay, let us continue. Where am I? All right, so then the Gemara asks, but wait a minute. Why are we concerned that the marten came in and somehow left crumbs somewhere else in the house? If he came in to get the bread, well, he came in to eat it, right? It's not like he's trying to make a little, bread fortress or some other toy. He's coming to eat it. So if he eats it, well, then there's no crumbs anywhere else in the house. He came to eat. He probably ate it. Why can't we assume that he ate it? And we have a good reason to assume that, because we have another Mishna. Now, I'm coming to some really inspiring teachings about the Hebrew prophetess Hulda. So bear with me. We're coming to that. First, we're going to get into a little bit of an uncomfortable zone. We're not going to be there long, so bear with me. Okay, so we have a teaching elsewhere that these martens and polecats and other kind of mammal that has this kind of behavior, they're a little bit like weasels and ferrets, this kind of slinky, quick animal, very hungry and very difficult to catch. So we have a teaching, there's a Mishna that in ancient times, in Israel, so if there was a house that was owned by a non-Jew, it would have a presumptive state of ritual impurity. Nothing to do with cleanliness or anything like that, just ritual impurity. So that if a Jew entered a non-Jew's house and then came out again, he would have to immerse in a mikveh before he could enter the Temple Mount, the grounds of the Holy Temple. Why? Because non-Jews are not obligated in the laws of purity and ritual impurity. It's not a concern to them, and there's no reason why it should be. But one of the practices that the sages observed from time to time in that time and place in ancient Israel is that non-Jews, if God forbid, a woman had a stillborn, so they weren't going to go through the whole process of having a funeral, etc. How would they dispose of the stillborn? They might, bury it in the house. The houses mostly had dirt floors, and they might dig a hole and actually bury it there in the house. That's no concern to the non-Jew, but for a Jew, there would be a dead body in the house under the ground, and its impurity would transmit upward, and then it would be impurity of the tent, tuma of the ohel, right? So when you're under a roof with a human corpse, even though you haven't touched the corpse, you would receive that tuma, that ritual impurity from the corpse, and then you would have to go through a purification process before you could enter the grounds of the temple. However, along with that teaching, it said that if we also have reason to believe that martens, these cute fuzzy creatures, or pigs or other animals of that sort, would have access to the dirt floor of that non-Jew's house, so then we wouldn't be concerned that a stillborn had been buried there because the animals would, sniff it out and remove it for their own eating purposes, as it were. So the point is that that if martens are around, then we can assume the thing they come for, they eat. And then once they've eaten it, it's no longer there. It's not a concern. So if the marten came in the house looking for chametz, why can't we assume that he ate the chametz and there's no concern? And Rabbi Zera says, because when it comes to something that is animal in nature in terms of food, prey, some kind of flesh, in this case the stillborn, well, the marten would at the very least drag it away all in one piece and do what it's going to do somewhere else. But with respect to bread, whether it ate it or dragged it away, it might well leave a few stray crumbs behind. And that's why we can't assume if we saw a marten taking some bread that there's no stray crumbs. In fact, if we saw a marten taking some bread, we will assume that there are stray crumbs, and therefore we need to search the house. Now, Rava will say, now, wait a minute. These cases are not comparable. There's so many assumptions here, right? Like the fact that a non-Jew lives there, and it's possible, remotely possible, but just possible, that there was a stillborn born in that house. And by the way, they don't even distinguish whether a single man lives there or a family. Nevertheless, this was in ancient times how it was a decree on the homes of non-Jews. They don't know that a stillborn is buried there. It's just a possibility. And so they're saying, well, it's a possibility. It's a slim possibility. But if that possibility is coupled with the idea that these animals can have access to the house, then we're not going to worry about it. So there's a great uncertainty that a stillborn even exists there. And then we're going to let, this other uncertainty override that the animal might have come. But here in the situation where we know there was chametz in the house, everyone has chametz in the house during the year, leaven products, and then we saw a marten come in, and take it. So now, what is the uncertainty that it might have left some crumbs behind? So why does are we going to let the uncertainty override the certainty? That's really the question. There definitely was chametz in the house. We definitely saw a marten come in and drag it away. The uncertain possibility that he might have dragged everything away is not going to be enough to override the certainty that there was chametz here and that a marten was seen dragging it away. But then the Gemara says, well, wait a minute. So you're saying that uncertainty never overrides an uncertainty never overrides a certainty? But don't we have another teaching that contradicts this idea? Where do we see that? Again, a little uncomfortable. So Rabbi Yehuda has a teaching that the maidservant of a certain violent man, we don't know anything about him other than he was a violent man, but this maidservant, a Jewish maidservant, had a stillborn child. And so she didn't dispose of it by burying it in the dirt floor of a house. She took it somewhere else to dispose of it. And in this case, it was a pit, right? So some kind of a pit, and she left it there. Perhaps they're saying he was a violent man, so she was scared of him. She just wanted to get rid of it and not deal with it anymore. But then she realized that she needed to know whether the stillborn was male or female, and she didn't know. Maybe it was a very, very young, small, very small being. And so then a Cohen, a priest, went on her behalf to look inside the pit so that he could see, the stillborn and see was it male or female. That affects her status now because her days of impurity, the number of days after giving birth, even if it's a stillborn, if a woman gives birth to any being, so then there's a certain number of days of tuma, of ritual impurity that she has to observe, and it's a different number if it's a female birth or a male birth. So since she didn't know, this Cohen went on her behalf to see in the pit if he could see it. There was no stillborn there. She told him for sure where she dropped it, but when he went there was nothing in the pit. And then later on, I guess it was probably his turn to officiate in the temple, and they needed to know whether he had contracted tuma, ritual impurity. Why? Because he technically was standing over a grave. Cohens, priests, don't enter cemeteries. They're only allowed to become tameh, ritually impure, through contact with a corpse or by walking over a grave for very close family members. And so why? Because they have to be ready to serve in the temple. And it became time for him to serve in the temple, and they weren't sure whether he was tameh, in which case he could not serve in the temple, or tahor, ritually pure, in which case he could serve in the temple. The question came before the sages, and they said, where were you? This certain pit. Well, that pit is known to have martens and polecats, go in and out of it. So if a stillborn was dropped in there, we can safely assume that that animal, the marten or the polecat, took it, for its own purposes and ate it. Dragged it away, and it wasn't there when you look, because you didn't see anything. It's because an animal dragged it away, and therefore you didn't stand over a dead body of the stillborn, and you did not contract ritual impurity. So from that Mishna, we learn, right, that what happened. For sure, the stillborn went into the pit. It's uncertain whether a marten or a polecat actually dragged it out of there. The odds maybe are good. But in that case, the sages said you don't have to worry about it. And so therefore, an uncertainty overrode a certainty. And that, in fact, is the law in those cases, right? It's actually, spelled out for that particular case as a law. A stillborn in a pit, if one leans over a pit in which there may be a stillborn and there are martens or similar animals in the area, the assumption is that an animal took the stillborn and ate it, and the person leaning over the pit is tahor, ritually pure. That is the law. So the sages are going to bring a few other cases to try and understand, when and how and why are there, what do the cases have in common where an uncertainty can override a certainty, and what do the cases have in common where they don't? And mostly it's going to be based on the leniency of rabbinic decrees versus the stringency of Torah laws. Now, we go back to our Mishnah to analyze this case. So one need not be concerned that a marten dragged away the leaven after we did the search. But the Mishnah also says, another Mishnah says that after we do the search, whatever leaven is now, been identified in the house, we don't remove it from the house yet. We only do that the next day at midday. So where do we do with it? We conceal it in one place, like in a sealed off area in the house. Now, one reason for that is just to remind everyone in the house that the next, until we actually remove it the next day at midday, don't go walking around the house eating a sandwich and leaving crumbs, because we just did a search to make sure that all those crumbs are removed. But another reason that we seal it somewhere in a very concealed area, let's say a sealed box in the kitchen, something like that, is because a marten might come in the house, take some of the chametz, and you might see the marten do that. And then, if you don't see the marten, you don't have to assume that a marten came in. But if you see a marten come in, then you do have to do the search over again. But if it's in a locked box, okay, then you're not going to have to worry about it. So what we're talking about is a case where he should have put it in a locked box, but he didn't. So even though it's not in a locked box, we don't have to assume that a marten took it unless we see the marten come in the house and take the bread. So apparently we are worried that a marten will come in and see it, right? So we don't have to assume that, but apparently we're worried about it. So Abaye explains, why are we worried? What is this concern that we're worried that a marten came in and that's why we're locking it in a box? See, this ruling that we conceal the leaven in the house, well, that is for the 14th of Nisan. Prior to that, like when we're doing the spring cleaning, before we do the actual search on the night of the 14th, when we're doing the whole spring cleaning, then we have no reason to believe that a marten came in the house and instead of just eating the bread, kind of dragged it off to hide it. Why? Because on the 13th of Nisan and before, everybody has bread in their houses. Bread is plentiful, so the martens aren't being so cagey and coy and trying to grab some bread and hide it in their hidey holes. But come the 14th of Nisan, when everybody's getting rid of their bread, so now bread is much more rare in all the houses, and if a marten can sniff some out and find it, then he is going to be cagey and coy and try to grab some bread and take it to his hidey hole. That's what Abaye says. And Rava responds, and is the Hulda a neviah that he knows what the date is? Meaning, so the marten in Hebrew, Hulda. And is the Hulda a neviah, a prophetess? Right? So he's making a play on words. It's a joke. He's asking, is the Hulda a prophet, or in this case, a female prophet, that he should know? He's such a brilliant animal. He knows what date it is on the Hebrew calendar and what all the people are doing around Israel. Now, the answer actually is yeah, because if all the people are removing bread from their houses, animals will quickly understand that their typical sources of food have, it's changed. There's much less food, and maybe their behavior will change accordingly. But in terms of what Rava is asking, is Hulda a neviah? It's a joke because Hulda is a neviah. Hulda, the word for a marten, is also the name of one of the 7 Hebrew prophetesses. And this is wonderful. I have to say, in college, I did read the entire Bible for a literature class, and I've been learning and studying for a long time. I haven't read the Bible cover to cover like I did in college, so it's not like I'm familiar with all the different areas of it. I feel like I should do another read. Maybe that's what we'll do, God willing, in 6.5 years when we finish Daf Yomi. The next project will be to go through the whole Bible, chapter by chapter. But so I had forgotten about Hulda, but Hulda is awesome. So she's a female prophet. She's prophesying in the kingdom of Judah during the reign of King Yoshiahu. So let's set the scene here. Who was she? It's really worth getting to know Hulda a little bit. Okay, so there was a very righteous king, Hizkiyahu. And so, in fact, if you visit Jerusalem and you take this amazing walk through the 600-meter water tunnel in the city of David in the pitch dark, we did it last year, before this whole crazy plague began. We were in the summer of 2019 in Israel. And so Hizkiyahu built that tunnel. Very righteous king. So his son, Menashe, not a righteous king. responsible for bringing all kinds of idolatry into Israel. Very bad. His son, Ammon, maybe even worse. Only thing good about him is he had a short reign. But those two kings allowed quite a bit of idolatry to be brought into the kingdom of Judah. And it was disastrous. God was furious. And was basically, and now we're, this is very late in the first temple period, and we're sort of headed toward the end of the first temple period. Hulda, and so then it's going to be Ammon. So Ammon is actually murdered by people in his household, and that brings his son Yoshiahu to power when he's 8 years old, right? So Yoshiahu is 8 years old when he becomes the king of Judah. Now, luckily, Yoshiahu was not raised by his idolatrous father or grandfather, and he had very fine teachers and brought up a very moral, righteous way, and ended up being a very righteous king. He took the reins of authority, as it were, when he was 16. And among his, almost immediate projects were to get idolatry out of the kingdom of Judah, to remove these idols and temples to Baal and Asherah, these idolatrous religions, just get them out. Collected a lot of money from the people and from his own treasury to sort of renovate and refurbish the first temple that had fallen into disrepair. So part of that project of cleaning up the temple and showing how much the people are dedicated to Hashem, to God, and his temple, the first temple, is part of that cleanup project. They sort of went into everywhere and really did a good job, and they found a Torah scroll that had previously been hidden, a very ancient Torah scroll, and they were wondering whether they brought it to him. He said, take it to the prophet to authenticate. Now, the prophet, when they said the prophet at that time, they meant Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, the great famous prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah is alive when the first temple falls, so we're sort of headed toward that. Jeremiah, there's a few years to go before that. Jeremiah will be there. But at this time, when this Torah scroll is found in the precincts of the temple, Jeremiah is out of town. He sort of went to visit the Jewish community in Assyria, and he couldn't verify this Torah scroll. So they brought it to the Neviah, to the female prophet, Hulda. Right? Now, Hulda was a relative of Jeremiah, by the way. So she and Jeremiah are both descendants of Yehoshua. Right? So Joshua, who took over for Moses at the end of the children of Israel wandering in the desert and led the children of Israel into the promised land. The first stop when they entered was Jericho, and there they received help. So he sort of sent two guys to check out the situation, and those two scouts who went into the land, ended up having to run for their lives from the king of Jericho. But they were saved by this woman, this righteous woman, Rahab, a righteous Gentile, who recognized that God is the true God and that the children of Israel, were with God. And she realized that, the kingdom that she was a part of was going to fall. Now, she was a prostitute at that time, but she, was very righteous in her heart. She converted, became Jewish, and ended up marrying Joshua. We have that in a tradition. And the offspring of Joshua and Rahab, through many generations, had a lot of very prominent people, including prophets and including Jeremiah and Hulda. Now, when they brought this Torah scroll to before her, and they opened it, and it randomly opened up in the fifth book of the Torah, Deuteronomy, Devarim in Hebrew, to the curses that would befall the Jewish people if they turned their back on God and started engaging in idolatry. And she said, well, that is a sign. It didn't open there randomly. It's because of everything that's going on, all the idolatry that's been going on for years in this land. And so she says, when they showed her the Torah, now, remember that lines of dialogue, as it were, a biblical character speaking dialogue is always very short, very terse. if you look at the famous passage of the binding of Isaac, all of the dialogue between Abraham and Isaac, would fit on like about a third to a half a page of a movie script, just one line, one line, one line. Certainly no speeches. So when somebody gets to speak 2, 3, 4 lines in a row in the Bible, it's a big deal. Now, so here's what happens. So the priest Hilkiah and Ahikam and Achbor and Shaphan and Asaiah went to the prophetess Hulda, the wife of Shallum, son of Tikva, son of Harshas, the keeper of the wardrobe of the king, who was living in Jerusalem in the Mishna, and they spoke to her. And she responded, "Thus said the Lord, the God of Israel, say to the man who sent you to me," the king, "Thus said the Lord, I am going to bring disaster upon this place and its inhabitants in accordance with all the words of the scroll which the king of Judah has read, because they have forsaken me and have made offerings to other gods and vexed me with all their deeds. My wrath is kindled against this place, and it shall not be quenched. But say this to the king of Judah who sent you to inquire of the Lord," through me, the prophetess, "Thus said the Lord, the God of Israel, as for the words which you have heard," this prophecy of doom, "because your heart was softened and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I decreed against this place and its inhabitants, that it will become a desolation and a curse. And because you rent your clothes and wept before me, I, for my part, have listened, declares the Lord." 6 verses, all in her voice. "Assuredly, I will gather you to your fathers, and you will be laid in your tomb in peace. Your eyes shall not see all the disaster which I will bring upon this place." And so they brought back the reply to the king, and her words were true. It's like idolatry had been piling up among the people and in the land for so many years, and the Lord was getting sick of it, and he was about to bring the great destruction that would be the destruction of the first temple to the land. But because Yoshiahu, the king, was righteous, and he sent to inquire to the prophetess Hulda how to conduct himself, and he learned from her and what was it meant that they opened this newly found Torah scroll to these verses, and he listened and he did his best. She said, "The Lord has decreed that, well, this destruction is coming, but it will not come in your lifetime." And indeed, Yoshiahu ruled for 31 years, and it was a peaceful reign. Tragically, the next 4 kings of Israel, 2 of them were his sons, one was his grandson, and then one of his sons again, and they presided over the fall of Jerusalem at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. And the final one, Zedekiah, I think is how you say his name, Tzidkiyahu, was the one that was dragged off to Bavel and blinded, and total disaster. The first temple destroyed, and though the second temple would be rebuilt 70 years later, there were many daily miraculous occurrences in the first temple that were not recreated in the second temple. So it's like we never really rose to that same spiritual stature that we had in the first temple's period, even though we did have another temple. But the second temple period, the land and the people were not at the same spiritual level that we were at during the first temple period. At any rate, this is Hulda, who is given 6 verses in the Bible. This is at second book of Kings, chapter 22, verses 14 through 20. And there's many fine articles about Hulda. You can read more about her. She was known to be a prophet and also a teacher. And she actually ran a yeshiva, a Torah academy for women. So wonderful. I also read as part of this research, there's not that many prophets, right, that we've heard of. I think the number is something like 40. But there's a tradition that there were actually hundreds of thousands of prophets. There were many people who were able to prophesy and connect with the Lord. The prophets whose prophecies have been recorded in the Bible are the ones whose words would be relevant to future generations, and that's a much smaller number. But, there's a lot to be learned and read about sort of, who was engaged in prophecy, etc. But there were only 7 female prophets that are recorded in Scripture. Who are they? Sarah, Abraham's wife. Miriam, the sister of Moses. Devorah, who was a judge in Israel before the period of the kings. Hannah, from whom many of the laws of Hebrew prayer are derived. We saw that when we were in Tractate Brachas. And she was the one who was praying and crying so bitterly that the high priest at that time in the temple thought that she was drunk. And she said, "No, I'm not drunk. I'm vexed in spirit." And he said, "Well, may you be blessed to have your prayers answered." And they were. And she had a child, which she dedicated to the service of God. And that child was the prophet Samuel, who would eventually anoint the first king, King Saul, and his replacement, King David. And then the other Hebrew female prophets were Abigail, who was the wife of a creep who tried to harm King David, but she warned King David of what was going on, and so King David was saved. He wasn't killed by her husband. Her husband was killed, and then she ended up marrying King David. And we see in Scripture that she herself received prophecy from God. And then Hulda, and the 7th is, of course, Esther, from the book of Esther and the Purim story. Right. So, and then to finish this discussion, so according to Rava, a marten, right, a Hulda in Hebrew, the animal, is not a prophet, obviously, and doesn't know what people are doing, but it can tell when food is scarce because the people have removed all the bread from their homes, and so it might well be more cagey and coy. So if you see a marten in your home after you've searched for leaven, it might not just eat the bread. It might try to store it because because bread is scarce and he wants to just, store up some bread in his lair. And in dragging it away, he might leave some crumbs. And so that's why if you don't see a marten, you don't have to be worried that one came in and took bread. But if you do see a marten, then you have to search your house again. And that is the law. That's what I've got for us this evening. Let me check if there's any comments or questions. Bill says, this incident with the martens and the ruling that there would be no end to it puts me in mind of a saying that a British friend of mine had when faced with similar issues: down that road, madness lies. Exactly, right? I mean, so the sages are mindful that, there's times where you have to be so careful because the smallest amount, can really have grave impact. But there's other times where if you instill a policy of being so stringently careful that there will be no end to the matter. And as Bill says, down that road, madness lies. Ali Zach says, thank you for providing these teachings. It has been a blessing to learn. I make it a point to listen to AT daily during my commute, since Talmud says you can't die when you are studying Torah. We're talking about that yesterday, right? We were talking about that just yesterday, that you get this extra measure of protection when you're involved in a mitzvah. And of course, the study of Torah is equivalent to all the mitzvahs. We learn that every morning in the prayer book. So we get, we can't risk our lives needlessly. We're not going to be saved from commonplace danger like going through a red light. But we do receive an extra measure of protection when engaged in a mitzvah, and Torah study is a great one. Lynn says, what a great backstory about Hulda. I had not heard that she authenticated Yeshayahu's found scroll. Wonderful. Thanks for adding this in tonight. You're welcome, Lynn. Lynn adds, and just as only 7 women prophetesses are recorded like the 40 men, we know / assume there were very many more women prophetesses as there were many more male prophets. Exactly. There were many, many more. What is the fellow's name? There's a great book, sort of Harry Potter-like books. He's written 2 of them. The first is called The Lamp of Darkness. I can't remember what the other one was. They're great, but they're books sort of set in this time period. It's kind of, and you can see like what the prophets were like, and that they would bring, people, talented musicians to help them get into the trance of the prophet. And it's contemporaneous with the prophet Eliyahu, Elijah. But check it out. It's on Amazon, The Lamp of Darkness, kind of like a young adult literature set in the time of the prophets. Very exciting story. I thought it was great. I'm sorry I'm spacing on the author's name right now. Bill Eldridge. I like that teaching on prophets, there being many, many, but only those whose teachings was for future generations are recorded. In my tradition, we have a similar axiom about saints. We will never know how many God has called to sainthood, for countless serve him in quiet and humble dignity. Absolutely. And in fact, we have a teaching in Judaism, often translated as saints. We're not talking about prophets here. We're talking about tzaddikim. So people who are entirely righteous, right? And so a good translation of a tzaddik is a saint, somebody who's entirely righteous. And the teaching is that the world stands because in every generation there are 36, exactly 36 fully righteous individuals. If not for them, there's just so much evil in the world that God would say, better to just end this whole thing like he did when he sent the flood, because there's just too much evil and suffering caused by the evil of humans in the world. But in the merit of the 36 tzaddikim, the 36 righteous, fully righteous individuals, the world continues to be, thank God. Finally, Sharon says, God spoke to Rivka. And, I was wondering about why Rivka is not included in this list of 7, right? Because Rivka received word from the Lord that there were two, we saw this in last week's parsha, right? That there were 2 weeks ago, that there are twins in her womb, Jacob and Esau, who will produce 2 nations, and one will serve the other. And that would seem to be prophecy. But as I recall, she went and inquired of the Lord. And what that means is she went to see a prophet, right? Sometimes in that context called an oracle, but somebody who received the word of the Lord. And so at least I've seen that as a tradition that she didn't receive the word directly. She received it from an intermediary, a human intermediary who was a prophet and was able to give her that prophecy. Otherwise, I agree with you. Why wouldn't Rivka be a prophetess? So it must be for that reason. All right, my friends, that's what I've got for us this evening. With God's help, we will resume tomorrow on Daf Yud, page 10 of Tractate Pesachim, the 4th volume of the Talmud. Have a really fine and blessed and peaceful evening.